Victor Hugo, the great French novelist, once said, "Nothing in the world is more powerful than an idea whose time has come." The idea dealt with on this program, communism. Its time came first in Russia in 1917, then it spread. Communist movements grew by leaps and bounds. And after World War II, Russian power imposed the communist system on a half-dozen independent nations on Russia's western border. And in 1949, communism's second great triumph, China. I am Dale Fuller, Director of the Social Science Foundation. You are about to see on motion picture film, which we have collected from our government in Washington, from the official state archives of Soviet Russia, and from newsreel cameramen in dozens of countries, what in one sense is one of the most phenomenal success stories of modern times, the story of the Communist Revolution. At the beginning of the 20th century, communism was but a dream in the minds of a handful of men. Today, it is the way of life of 1/3 of the people of the world, and communist moons are encircling the earth at 20 times the speed of sound. Usually, communist success has been explained in terms of marching armies and execution squads. Recently, however, we have begun to understand an important fact, namely that the industrial and economic achievements of Russia under communism have appealed to people in many parts of the world. For communism has two faces. The first is the face seen by people in the United States and most of the advanced nations of the West. This is the face of terror, brutality, the power of the Red Army, the cunning of the secret police. The other face is the one seen by underprivileged and distressed people in many parts of the world. They see in Russia a backward nation modernized, an illiterate people taught to read, a land of peasants converted into a nation of engineers, scientists, doctors, and musicians. And communism cannot be completely understood unless both these aspects are clearly seen. We take you now on a tour through the vast maze of the Communist Revolution as it turns first one face and then the other toward a troubled world. This is Karl Marx. This is Frederick Engels. These two brilliant thinkers expounded the ideas of communism in the 19th century. Ideas that spread around the world among intellectuals and radicals. In the industrial countries of the West, these ideas caused unrest and agitation. In one country, however, these ideas started a series of chain reactions which spluttered and fumed, and by 1917, rocked the earth. That country was Tsarist Russia, a country with an abundance of poverty, toil, hopelessness. A country ruled by an autocrat who made great use of police terror. The ruler of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, was heir to a tradition of militarism and war. August 1914, war with Germany. 15 million Russian men ordered into the trenches. 2 million lost their lives. And back home, starvation. March 1917. Enough of death and famine, enough of absolutism and terror. The fury of the Russian people piled up and spilled over into the streets of Moscow and Petrograd. This was the end of Tsarism, and no one force accomplished this revolution. The old regime fell under the impact of its own blunders and the suffering of the Russian people. The Tsar was overthrown, a new temporary government was formed, but did not take Russia out of the war. The killing went on, and the smell of death was everywhere. And now the spirit of Karl Marx returned to Petrograd in the form of Vladimir Lenin. It was not enough, he told his aroused followers, that the Tsar was gone. The communist movement, the Bolshevik Party, must seize power, bring an end to the war, and set up a socialist state. He drove this message home with all the power of his voice. Peace, land, bread was the cry of the Bolsheviks. All power to the councils of workers in Petrograd and Moscow, the councils in which the Bolsheviks played a militant role, all power to the Soviets. November 1917, soldiers, factory workers, sailors in Petrograd marched on the Winter Palace, stormed it, occupied it. The Tsar was gone. The temporary government was helpless. The Bolsheviks were in power. That same evening, representatives from councils all over Russia met in Petrograd. Lenin walked to the platform. "We shall now," he cried, "begin to construct the socialist order." The communists took Russia out of the World War. The nation was shrunken and in ruins. Reconstruction began under Lenin's leadership. But during the winter of 1924, Vladimir Lenin, long in poor health, died. Many mourned. And shortly thereafter, a new era began in Russian history, the era of Joseph Stalin. Stalin was the pseudonym of Joseph Zhugashvili, son of a poor cobbler in Asiatic Russia. The name Stalin fitted, for it meant steel. And this became the great obsession of Soviet Russia, steel. Only an industrialized nation would develop socialism, Marx and Engels had said. Russia must become a nation not of timber, but of steel, not of peasants and farmland, but of workers and machines. "150 million people, most of them poor peasants, were now mobilized in a gigantic effort based on a single goal: industrialize. We must create a whole new generation of mechanics," Stalin said. "We must become technicians and engineers. We must take the tremendous power of our rivers, control it with huge dams, and convert it into electricity." In 1928, the first of a series of large-scale 5-year plans was begun. And by 1940, Russia was far different from the land of the Tsars. Peasants were operating giant cranes. The nation now produced 5 times as much coal and 4 times as much oil. Four times as much steel. "48 times as many machine tools and 25 times as much electrical power." A nation that had had no tractors now had 500,000. Much of farming organized into collectives where farmers worked as in a great rural factory. But for this progress, a terrible price was paid. While machines were being turned out, there was less meat and less bread and milk. An order went out: death or exile to those peasants who refused to collectivize their farms. But the nation paid an even higher price, a price summed up in one word: dictatorship. A dictatorship of the Communist Party, declaring itself the voice of all the workers. A dictatorship of one man, the voice of the party, Joseph Stalin. Stalin, who linked his name with Lenin, was portrayed by party propagandists as the man who could do no wrong. Stalin, acclaimed by communists all over the world as the great builder of socialism. Stalin is our leader. And for those who did oppose Stalin, and there were many, no mercy. Trotsky exiled to die in Mexico, the victim of a murderer's pickaxe. Kamenev and 15 others executed by court order. Zinoviev by the same firing squad. Bukharin, all of them old Bolshevik leaders. Tukhachevsky, all of them associates of Lenin. Thousands more died in the mass purges of the 1930s, in addition to the millions of peasants liquidated in the early years of collectivization. Stalin's rule had to be secure. But there was also the other face of communism. Party propagandists asked the Russian peasants, "Is not your life better than before?" Is not Russia now one of the great industrial powers of the world? Is not Russia now more democratic than under the Tsar? Now there is a Supreme Soviet with representatives from all over Russia, said party leaders. Ordinary people now sitting in Moscow, working people instead of nobles, women treated as equals. The communists pointed out that everyone in Russia had a job. The harvests were richer. Tomorrow, they said, perhaps there would be more meat and milk and butter. Why worry about executions, secret police, dictatorship? Think of the future, the dream of Marx and Engels. Yes, think of the future. For some Russians, then, there was hope for the future. This new Russia was soon put to a tremendous test, for in June of 1941, the attack came. Nazi Germany, having conquered most of Europe, now turned 2 million men, supported by thousands of tanks and planes, against the Soviet Union. It was the greatest land invasion the world had ever seen. Russia's army fell back with tremendous losses. Her cities were devastated, her towns occupied, and her people were in despair. But this was not the backward Russia of the Tsars. This was a more modern industrial nation whose people were determined to defend their homeland. The people of Russia now fought bitterly against the invaders of their country. For some, no price was too great if it hurt the enemy. And in the end, they drove back the supermen, humbled the soldiers of the master race who had brought ruin to much of the civilized world. Europe was invaded by American and British forces, and Hitler had to fight on 3 fronts. His armies were battered, his cities left in ashes. The Nazi dream of conquest buried forever. The war was over. There was only one language now. One word: victory. But how long could friendship last when the common enemy was no more? War had changed Europe. The old regimes were gone. Who would rule now? Lenin had once made a prediction. Out of war, he said, the working classes would ride to power. Stalinist Russia, which had revealed heroism and sacrifice in the war, once again turned its other face to the world. Communism rushed into the vacuum of Eastern Europe. In Poland, communists took over. In Hungary, they forced their way into the leadership. In Romania, a people's democracy set up, synonym for communist rule. In Bulgaria, opposition quickly suppressed. In Yugoslavia, the communist leader of the wartime resistance, Marshal Tito, became the ruler. And behind the lightning moves of local communists in each country was the power of the Red Army and the leadership of Joseph Stalin. The final thrust came in Czechoslovakia, a nation with a democratic tradition. Democratic leaders Jan Masaryk and Edvard Beneš. In 1948, the well-organized communist movement in Czechoslovakia struck. Beneš and Masaryk removed. For the Communist Revolution, this was victory. But perhaps the greatest triumph came the following year. 400 million Chinese, tired of war, tired of suffering, told it is not too late for a new vision, a new life, told communism will end the centuries of despair, and they listened. In 1949, after 18 continuous years of war and civil war, communism ruled unchallenged on the mainland of China. Altogether, 1/3 the human race was now living under communism. And why not more, said the communists. Nothing in the world, French novelist Victor Hugo had said, nothing in the world is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Surely the 20th century was the time for communism in the minds of the party stalwarts. Everywhere in the world, communists agitated for change. Capitalism brought war, destruction, death, they said. Communism would bring peace. But in Malaya, the communists engaged in civil war, and in Korea, in June 1950, invasion. 3 years of fighting, 3 years of suffering. And now, a grim announcement from the Kremlin. Soviet Russia possessed the hydrogen bomb. This was the other face of communism in its most terrifying aspect. About this same time, the communist world was shaken by a series of events. In the communist stronghold East Germany, revolt. Perhaps communism could not be maintained by force. In Poznan, Poland, riots against the regime. And in Korea, the communists were forced to make peace. Tito's Yugoslavia was stubbornly maintaining its independence of Moscow. In West Berlin, the communist blockade failed. And in October 1956, Budapest, Hungary, rebellion. Revolt against both communism and Russian domination. Students and workers asking an independent Hungary, freedom of the press, an end to capital punishment. and asking an end to the terror which had originally been imposed by Joseph Stalin. But the Red Army marched, smashed the rebellion with brutal efficiency. In 1953, Stalin had died. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, promised an end to Stalin terror. Stalin's hangman, Beria, was put to death. But was this an end to terror or just a continuation? Even loyal communists were asking questions. Togliatti in Italy asked, what about Hungary? Gomulka in Poland asked, can we not be communist and be independent of Russian control? Young communists wanted to know what has happened to the dream of Marx and Engels. Must we drink the nectar of human progress as did the pagans of old, only from the skulls of the slain? Within Russia itself, the death of Stalin, the promise of more freedom, brought stirrings. Communism now turned its other face to the world and to its own people. Not by bread alone, a criticism of Soviet bureaucracy, published, read by thousands. Communism had brought great changes to Russia. She was now second in industry only to America, and the threat of famine was departing. And now, perhaps, a promise beginning to come true, the promise of more food, clothing, luxuries. Time for enjoyment. The Gorky Amusement Park in Moscow. Who but the aristocrats had time for fun in the days of the czars? A nation of champions, the world's greatest chess players, a once illiterate people now going to school. By the 1950s, startling scientific achievements in the land of communism. The world's largest atom smasher, the first operating jet airliner anywhere. Soviet medicine employing the most modern techniques. A rare operation on a blind woman. Radioactive isotopes. The world made visible again. And in 1957, the most spectacular achievement of Soviet science, Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2. The first man-made satellites in history circling the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour. Next objective, the moon. The backward country of the czars, now a land of science, but also a land of culture, dancing, literature. The Moiseev dance group acclaimed everywhere in the world. Talented young people picked out for training. The famous composer Khachaturian conducting one of his own symphonies. The great ballerina Ulanova. Yes, America was ahead, but the Soviets were catching up. Television in a land where one generation ago electricity was unknown. Things to tell the world about other police and concentration camps. Soviet leaders Khrushchev, Bulganin were eager to spread the word, and everywhere were people coming forward to listen. In Burma, they were greeted excitedly, warmly. In India, Nehru met them. In China, Mao Zedong. In Egypt, Nasser. And to Moscow came representatives from the countries of Asia and Africa, the Prince of Yemen, the Shah of Iran, and Western leaders too, Hansen of Denmark, Adenauer of Germany. To Moscow from all over the world came young people to study, to observe. And when they left, what were their memories? Perhaps, like the rest of the world's, which looking at communism today has memories of two kinds. the ruins of Budapest, the grace of the Bolshoi Ballet. The terrible power of the Red Army, and the education of a new generation. The countenances of despair and the vision of hope. You have seen on motion picture film the two faces of the Communist Revolution. You have seen terror and joy, fear and confidence. Whether one of these aspects will triumph over the other, no one really knows. However, certain things are becoming clearer. Communism is not simply a facet of Russian history. It is a worldwide phenomenon encompassing people of every continent, of every color, 800 million of them. Its power cannot be scorned. The appeal which it has for some people cannot be ignored. While we in the Western democracies have seen communism largely in terms of brute force and repression, many people of Asia and Africa, and even distressed people of the West, see in it a way out of their age-old misery. Probably communism will not topple of its own weight. Probably it cannot be bludgeoned into submission. Therefore, the answer to the communist challenge cannot be found simply in terms of military power. The answer to the communist challenge must also be found in terms of its promises, economic progress, cultural and scientific advance. And even more important, the answer must be found in terms of what it does not offer and cannot offer, and what the world so desperately needs, namely freedom of the individual to think as he wishes, to speak as he wishes, and to allow his conscience to leap every wall of authority and orthodoxy free from fear.
This is National Educational Television.